ridiculously cold
Yeah.
last week. So biking around with all of my wool on. I got some new windproof mittens. So that's what I'm all about lately.
It's 40 below up here in Duluth when I woke up this morning.
Oh.
What?
That's with wind chill, but I definitely am a big fan of layers too.
That's crazy.
That is insane. Yeah.
Morgan, feel free to keep on inviting or admitting other people too as you see them.
Yeah, here once it gets below about 50, we really complain about how cold it is.
I am, yeah, 50 below, you mean? Or
No, 50 above.
Oh, 50 above. Yeah. Okay. That's about my speed. I can't do much below that myself. I force myself to get on the bike a little bit with the colder temperatures, but
that's tough.
Yeah, it's really not okay.
Hey, well, welcome. You've come to the right place if you're looking for an amazing conversation tonight with a real live climate scientist. Yes, they do exist. We have the wonderful Dr. Kim Cobb, and we'll get started in just 1 minute. But in the meantime, feel free to use the chat to introduce yourself, share where you're calling in from, how cold it might be, celebrate the fact that we still do have winter, and we'll get started in just 1 minute here. Good to see some familiar friends and faces, as well as some new attendees. Thanks so much for joining us. Hey there, Dana. Hey, Stuart. Hey, Laura. Hey, Mark. Hey, Reef. Hey, Peter. Excellent. All right, well, we are at the top of the hour. So what I'm actually going to do is just a quick review of the housekeeping. And then I'll pass it to Dana and Dr. Cobb to take it from here. So we are recording this training. It's going to be available after tonight on our YouTube channel. I'll put a link to that in just a little bit. All lines are muted just so that we don't get any feedback, but we will open up our poll everywhere for questions in just a little bit. It isn't live quite yet, but we'll let you know in just a little bit. The format's really straightforward. We're going to have Dr. Cobb give a brief presentation, and then we'll have a lot of time for questions and answers, hence the AMA. So if you're having any tech difficulties, we're not going to be able to help you. We encourage you to call Zoom support. That's what they're for. That number is 1-888-799-9666. And without further ado, I will just welcome everyone to tonight's quarterly AMA. We're so glad you can join us. We're so honored to have our esteemed guest, Dr. Kim Cobb, and I'll pass it to Dana to do the introduction and take it from here.
Okay, thanks, Brett. Yes, very, very lucky and excited to have Kim Cobb. She is the Georgia Power Chair and Professor in the School of Earth and Atmospheric Sciences at Georgia Tech. Also the Director of the Global Change Program there at Georgia Tech, and she serves as the Advanced Professor for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the College of Sciences. In her climate research, she uses observations of past and present climate to advance our understanding of future climate change impacts, with a focus on climate extremes and coastal flood hazards. Kim received her BA from Yale University, one of my favorite universities, in 1996, and her PhD in oceanography from the Scripps Institute of Oceanography in 2002, one of Danny Richter's favorite institutions. In her research, Kim has sailed on oceanographic cruises and led caving expeditions in the Borneo rainforests. That sounds very cool. She received an NSF Career Award, a Presidential Early Career Award for Scientists and Engineers, and the Hans Oettinger Medal from the European Geosciences Union in 2019. She was a lead author of the IPCC 6th Assessment Report that was released just last summer. And as a mother of four, Kim is a strong advocate for women in science, and she champions diversity and inclusion in all that she does. She's also devoted to the communication of climate change to the public through her media appearances, public speaking, and social media channels. And she enjoys frequent exchanges with policymakers about climate impacts and solutions, which we at CCL very much appreciate. So thanks, Kim. Why don't you take the floor and tell us what you want to tell us?
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dana, for that introduction. And thanks everybody for being here for this chat tonight. I'm really excited to share, I guess, some of my own personal journey what brings me to the work and what keeps me going in the work as well. And really quickly, hopefully want to get to your questions, because this is an Ask Me Anything session. So I'm really value your input and kind of interactions, which is why I'm here doing this at 8 p.m. on a school night, as they say in my house. So let me just share some of my journey and kind of end with some of the work, accelerating through, if you will, some of the awkward bits of my professional career, kind of land us in some of the work that I'm most excited about right now, and hope you might be too, as people who really care about climate stable future. And then hopefully that will spur some interesting discussion about the kinds of different choices at different scales and how we can kind of engage for broader scale change, which is, I know, all of our collective mission. So here is me in my former life as an oceanographer. So I'm a trained oceanographer. I work on corals for my graduate work. And this is a picture looking into the equatorial Pacific climate history as recorded in a coral core that you can see me drilling there with this very large hydraulic drill in the middle of literally the middle of the Pacific Ocean, an island called Fanning Island in this case. And this is about, probably this piece is maybe 20 years of different ocean temperatures recorded month by month by month by this coral continuously growing through these last several decades. And then what my whole life's work till this point has really been about amassing this archive of ocean temperatures as recorded in coral skeletons back 7,000 years at the very least, and then really is very strong focus on the last millennium where we have most of our coral material available. So that really helps, for example, put into context the current rates of tropical ocean warming against a longer natural baseline. It helps us look into the causes of natural variations in this very remote region. They're tied to solar variability or volcanic variability. But the main reason why I have been chasing that for almost 30 years now is because this is an incredible and very unique archive of the history of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, which is kind of the most mysterious climate cycle that we have on our planet. It's the second largest climate cycle that we have on our planet outside the seasonal cycle. And it really is something that, as long as we can see the oceans in their current configuration millions of years ago, we see this phenomenon beating through the entire Earth system from Greenland to Antarctica every several years. That's how strong it is. And so really understanding how this climate phenomenon has evolved in the recent past, is changing today, and where it might be going in the future has been kind of the unique scientific obsession of my entire research career to date. And so it's been wonderful to work in the kind of the heart of the El Nino region in the middle of the Pacific Ocean to get these kind of primary, very direct views of this history of this climate cycle. And, you know, one of the recent expeditions, I'm going to show you kind of before and after pictures from a series of expeditions we conducted over the last major El Nino event, which took place across 2015 to 2016. And, you know, 2016 still reigns supreme as the largest global temperature on record, right? So it still holds the prize for #1, of course, followed, you know, by 2020 and #2. But at any rate, what happened in the Pacific Ocean is kind of documented in these kind of before and after photos, what exactly happened during that very large El Nino event when it is combined with decades of ocean warming that have piled up to this date. And so we have the reef on the left that I was diving on in 2014 that looks very much like the reefs I dived at this site for the previous decades of my work. Very diverse, very colorful, lots of different species, almost 100% coral cover. That is the mark of a very healthy reef there, which is, again, so healthy because it's so far away from so much of the damage that many other reefs incur. And that's why, in part, we were there to look at the record as recorded in these very remote reefs. And then fast forward to the middle of 2016 when the second photo was taken. And here you can see what 10 months of very elevated record-breaking ocean temperatures did to this very same patch of reef that is pictured on the left there. And so these temperatures were far beyond the threshold for coral bleaching, and they actually tipped into the threshold for coral mortality. And so the ocean warming event that occurred over 10 straight months of coral bleaching level temperatures actually tipped this reef into mortality rates above 85, 90%. And so you're looking at a graveyard on your right there. All that's left of that reef are these algal covered dead coral skeletons and a couple tiny little resilient corals hanging on for dear life. Some of the species on that reef were wiped completely off the reef during that event. And so I go into detail in discussing this because this was really, I'm not a coral ecologist, I'm really a physical climate scientist. I studied the coming and goings of ocean temperature and hydrology in these large scale climate cycles. But when I was there doing my work, pursuing the core basic research that I do, this is something that I had to bear witness to personally and repeatedly over the course of many different repeat expeditions at my site. And so, you know, something like that changes you. And it changed me profoundly, and it changed me in a kind of forever way. And so kind of coming on the heels of all that happened in 2016, in the early part of 2016, witnessing this death and destruction. And then in November 2016, out on another expedition, diving on dead reefs, of course, you know, the United States elected the Trump administration, and you know, we dug in, you know, as a nation to what we knew would be, you know, 4 years of, you know, not just, you know, delay on the climate agenda, but of course, attempts to erode the science and erode the consensus and the robustness of our work in the public's eye and in the eyes of policymakers. And that's, of course, exactly what happened. And so that confluence is something that kind of prodded me into thinking about, you know, what could be next for me. And, you know, what I quickly realized as a coral scientist was something that I thought would be a 2050 reality where my reef would be suffering some sustained level of bleaching was, of course, you know, wishful thinking beyond all measure, because 2016 had killed the reef that I call my home away from home. And so we were so profoundly out of time. I had so profoundly miscalculated the pace of climate change impacts, even in my own study site that I knew so well. And so just the dawning realization that this was, you know, at our doorstep in our house, making itself, you know, comfortable on our sofas was really too much to kind of really permit me to kind of stay the course on my previous agenda of basic research. And so I kind of started thinking about how I could throw myself professionally and personally into an agenda that's centered on climate solutions. And so I'm going to show you some of the work that has come of that kind of pivot, that exploration and that investment over the last 3 years from a research perspective. And I'm sure you're also interested in some of the personal, you know, aspects of the transformation as well. And I'm happy to talk about those, but I wanted to show some pictures from the research because I think it's really telling how we can retool our research toolkits, and we can retool our professional lives, frankly, to be in service to climate solutions, no matter really where we sit. Of course, I have all these climate science skills that could be redeployed very readily, although tell that to academia because it's not so easy as it turns out. But it's so heartening to see so many people ask themselves how they could turn their professional lives as well as their personal lives to the challenge of our day. And so this is one thing I'm really proud about. This is not recent. This is something I've been doing for over 15 years called the Carbon Reduction Challenge. And it's really been inspiring and to recognize how big a difference a handful of students can make in designing and implementing very large scale energy efficiency programs with very large organizations. And so we've worked with multinational corporations, we've worked with mom and pop hairdresser joints and everything in between to try to build our impact through time. And so now we're knocking on the ceiling of 20 million pounds of carbon dioxide saved from a single cohort of 20 or 30 students who have many other things going on in their lives. So my class is just one of many, and yet they're still able to bring these savings home. So engaging the next generation, I have the benefit of working at Georgia Tech and working with these amazing students, and they've kind of spurred me forward in thinking about what's next, what could be, what if we dream bigger, what if we do better, and bringing them along for the ride is just been so rewarding. In terms of looking into other ways to, hold on a second, I skipped some, in other ways to think about throwing yourself into solutions and bringing people together around a framework for carbon reduction is an example that I'm showing here called Drawdown Georgia. You may know Project Drawdown is a global scale framework for reversing global warming. This is just drawing that down into Georgia and asking ourselves, what are the top 20 to 30 solutions for Georgia in terms of the knobs we could turn to achieve carbon neutrality? We have our big sectors lined up there on this slide. You can see them, obviously ranging from electricity to the land sinks, where we have so much forest in Georgia. And thinking about the individual level engagement, as well as, of course, going up to corporate. And eventually, we, of course, hope to engage our state leaders in adopting so much of this plan. So that's been really wonderful to be a part of a large consortium of research scientists looking into this and bringing that, we call it bringing climate solutions home to Georgia, and really being able to talk to Georgians about what it means to be a part of the solution in a state where we are under a lot of political microscopes and a lot of movement on the climate front as well. I wanted to switch to our work in adaptation quickly before I open up for questions. This is something that I've found so deeply inspiring, the seminal work that Jeremy Hoffman has done in Richmond, Virginia, to map urban heat extremes across Richmond and overlay them, in this case, with maps of historic redlining to illustrate that these are completely overlapping in space. And so the areas that have been subject to the impacts of structural and systemic racism, disinvestment through time, are those areas where we have large African-American populations and low-income populations, and those are the most vulnerable populations to heat, and that's where it's hottest. So just amazing work out of that group. And of course, we've been looking to follow that up in Atlanta, and I'm really excited to co-direct Urban Heat ATL with my colleague, Dr. Nataki Osborne-Jelks at Spelman College. We're putting these sensors into the hands of students at Spelman, students at Georgia Tech, and community members in South Atlanta, where we do have very large populations of low income, historically marginalized communities, and mapping meter by meter temperature extremes across our city, working with the city, working with the county to try to think about what that could mean for emergency planning, but also what it could mean in terms of city planning and green space and transportation corridors and housing efficiencies, et cetera. So that's just a year old, but I'm really excited about the work that community scientists can do in advancing this kind of work. Don't take it from me, take it from the experts who sat on our opening debut panel. You can go to urbanheatatl.org. You can listen to these seminal experts, including folks like Marshall Shepard, Chandra Farley, who have been working in this space for way longer than me. And it's very good use of 30 minutes of your time if you have it. Okay, the second thing I want to talk about is a project down the coast called Smart Sea Level Sensors. And this is a project that's much older. It's about 4 years old now. So doing the math, you will see that that's one of the first things that I sought out after my kind of crisis of faith as a coral researcher. And it's just been so rewarding to work with the city of Savannah, in particular, Nick Deffley, the director of sustainability down there, who took many cold calls from me back in the day, and Randall Matthews, who likewise is associate director for the Chatham Emergency Management Agency down in Savannah. And they're helping us think about designing and deploying and building tools to support coastal resilience based on these small Georgia Tech, low-cost Georgia Tech design sensors. And so I think I have a picture of that right here. So here's the map of the 60 some odd sensors that we've installed to date. It's the highest density network of sea level sensors in the world. Very proud of that. It's in Savannah, of all places. And you can see on the bottom left that kind of shoebox size sensor that we're deploying. It's about $300 in parts. And really, it started some very long overdue conversations amongst community members, amongst policymakers and officials who are really coming to grips with the fact that their very low-lying, vulnerable coast is very ill prepared for the kinds of flood events that are happening today, let alone the ones that science is very clear will come in the next decades. And so you're really thinking about how do we engage communities to plan kind of with an evidence-based framing, but also one that's grounded in the politics, the culture, the geography, the history of that place, which is, of course, what you have to do. It has to be locally grounded. There's no technology that's going to wave a magic wand and ride you out of some of that hard work that's going to be need to be done. But it's an honor to sit at the table with residents in Savannah, with the mayor of Savannah, and so many stakeholders who are really committed, deeply committed to a sustained conversation around sea level rise and solutions. So I want to throw a shout out of thanks to all those collaborators on the very large team across so many institutions who have made that possible. With that, I'm going to stop. There's a lot, but I hope it was a flavor for why I am so passionate about climate solutions now and ever more committed to this journey that we're on together, and basically more confident than ever that we will actually find our way to a climate stable future, and we will rise this moment and move to protect the most vulnerable communities from climate change impacts. We've seen forcible movements in Washington, D.C. this year, of course. And I think it's, of course, a momentum that we can't afford to let up, but that is a mark of the decades to come. That's my view. So love to hear your questions. I'll stop sharing.
Great, Kim. Thanks. That was excellent. So if people want to ask questions or upvote questions that we will ask first, you go to pollev.com/CCL123 at the top of the screen there. Before we get to those, I'm going to cheat and ask the first question because I'm curious about the health status of your coral reef site today. Is it like recovered at all?
So it has experienced some recovery, but corals grow very slowly. And so if you put your finger up, it's about 1 centimeter per year or so. And those are some of the faster growing species that we have. And so all of the older corals were completely wiped out during that temperature extreme. And so all that was left were corals that were about, much less than basketball size. I don't know what kind of ball that would be. We don't really have a ball that size. 8 inches or so in diameter. And so what we see now is those are slightly bigger. They're maybe like basketball size. And then we see a lot of small recruits that are smaller than my finger in length, because they're only 3 or 4 years old for the most part. We see areas that were once dominated by coral, now dominated by seagrass. That's a very common response to the collapse of the coral reef, collapse of the herbivore fisheries that needed that reef for food, for shelter. And so there's been this trickle-on knock-on effects of, we would call it disequilibrium in science, but you could think about an imbalance in the ecosystem. And we're still reeling through so much of that. And the problem is it's not going to be, 10, 20 years of kind of moving into a new stable state of reef development before we're going to have another ocean temperature extreme that's going to set that process back. And so I truly believe in my heart of hearts that we'll never get that reef back that we had in 2014. That the time for kind of intervening in that reef has unfortunately gone. And now we're looking at which reefs are going to be next, where is the ocean warming episode going to happen next, and how can we harness the tools of science and engineering to think about bolstering coral reef resilience through bioengineering approaches, through genetic modifications, through reserving some portions of the coral reef environments across the world as nurseries that might limp through this. So we don't really have any great tools in our toolbox to help corals limp through these coming decades of ocean warming and acidification. But certainly I'm hopeful and semi-confident that there will be some corals that emerge on the other side. Geology tells us that they're one of the most successful and resilient organisms out there. But the fact that we will lose over 90% of the coral reefs in this century is certainly sobering for me as somebody who loves coral reefs so much.
Yeah. Along those lines, actually, our second question here is there anything we can do about coral preservation in our day-to-day lives?
I mean, don't emit greenhouse gases. Yeah, that's my number one answer right now. I mean, the threats to coral reef are global in scope, and anything that we have done to try to create reserves, even the coral nursery efforts that are going on in Florida right now, we may be learning how to reseed the global reefs of, later this century, should we be so fortunate to cool the planet later this century. So we're learning about how to be good stewards of coral, engineering, basically. I'll say it that way. But what we need to do right now is make sure that we limit warming to the lowest level possible if we want to preserve the most reefs, and that's through greenhouse gas reductions, pushing for the kinds of structural policies we know need to occur, volunteering with CCL has been so important in moving the needle. So this is where the battle lines are drawn. There's really nothing we can do collectively short of keep our eyes on the greenhouse gas prize.
Yeah, that's what we're here working on.
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. Top question. I like, 'cause it's like a very skeptical science type question. A popular response to climate change is that this is natural, it's happened before. So what have you seen during your paleoclimate research to support or dispute that claim?
Well, certainly, the existence of global warming doesn't, rise or fall or sink or swim on one record from one site generated by one scientist, which is kind of what that question is implying. However, let me humor that question and say that when we do reconstruct ocean temperatures from the middle of the Pacific Ocean, from these corals that didn't know any better, we do see clearly an indicator for very large, fast, unprecedented warming during the 20th century that we don't see in any of the previous centuries. Moreover, we also find that the El Nino signatures that are embedded in these coral skeletons, the extremes of warms and cool events, that's part of this natural cycle I've been studying, that there's evidence in the coral records that cycle has intensified in the last half century so, relative to a much longer multi-millennium baseline. That's one of the more controversial findings out of my lab. I'm sticking to it, and there's some very important evidence that lines up to support that. So even from this one site in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, we can see clearly the fingerprints of global warming at this site, which is not a surprise. And then we can go further into looking at what are the regional scale changes that are afoot right now, and what does that mean for our future? And so that's really where our field is focused right now. The IPCC has several tomes of information to really help us understand just how robust our understanding is of the impact of greenhouse gases on our climate system. And it goes way beyond global warming at this point into a whole host of other climate and weather extremes. In the recent synthesis report, in the sixth assessment report just released in August. And now we're talking about impacts on tropical storms, where impacts on agriculture, ecological drought, impacts on extreme rainfall, impacts on wildfires, making its first appearance in this report as well. Perhaps no surprise given the emergence of this climate impact in real time over the last 5 years. So, really, I think you only need to look around you to see the unprecedented territory we are in terms of climate change impacts and the pace of them and how they stretch from season to season and hemisphere to hemisphere. And then, of course, the science is able to connect those dots better than ever. So, I think that's a question for maybe 20 years ago. And now we're really pushing into regional climate changes and trying to equip decision makers and communities with the critical information they need that's geographically specific to help them weather the coming warming as best as possible and all the impacts that it will bring, and also help them bring into clear focus the need to reduce greenhouse gases so dramatically over this decade so as we can reduce by 50% to 2030 in line with the Paris target. So this is where the stakes are right now.
Yeah. So in your data, are you seeing an increase in the magnitude or frequency of El Nino cycle events or both?
Yeah, so it's less the frequency. That is actually very hard to determine with the kinds of records that we generate. Or let me put it this way, there's no evidence for changes in frequency over this very long extended time frame. It comes in and out of different frequencies, but it's really the strength that we can speak more specifically to and kind of benchmark in a very quantitative way with past centuries. And when we look at these pattern of magnitudes over the last centuries to millennia, we can see that we infer that there's been a 27% increase in the strength of the El Nino cycle coming into the last 50 years relative to that much longer baseline. And when we compare that to climate model simulations, where you just run it in continuous greenhouse gases for a very long time, we don't see those kinds of changes in the long model simulations under kind of static conditions. And so that leads us to believe that there has been already an increase in El Nino amplitudes, and that, of course, going forward, we should expect more of the same if this pile of emerging evidence is correct. But I have to stress that this is not something that you'll find in the IPCC report, and therefore, we shouldn't put it firmly in the column. That's how conservative that process is. It doesn't get to be in the column of known impacts until there are multiple and very strong lines of evidence supporting those links to greenhouse gases. So stay tuned, but I am deeply honored through the work in my lab to have contributed one kind of piece of evidence on this emerging pile, and we'll see where it lands in the coming years. But even if it's not landing on the side of robust climate impacts, I like to stress that people who are very sensitive stakeholders and care a lot about whether El Nino is changing in response to climate change, there's beginning to be enough evidence piling up that if you're very sensitive, if you have fisheries or energy facilities or water control management facilities, that you might want to kind of hedge against that potential future way before the IPCC puts it in the known column of impacts, because that might be, of course, the best path in terms of avoiding potentially disastrous outcomes if you're sensitive. So that's a really important distinction to make between how we talk about science from the IPCC lens versus how we can talk to stakeholders on the ground about our own work and what it might mean for them in the context of the broader IPCC process.
Interesting, thanks. Okay, when you have the opportunity to discuss these observations about coral die-offs with conservative policymakers, what types of reception have you received?
Well, for the most part, I'm not really privy to conservative lawmakers who have coral reefs in their territory. So the people that I've spoken with about these coral losses, who are direct stakeholders, who have economies that depend on coral reef health, whose communities are protected by that reef from storm damage and wave activity and erosion, would be the Republic of Kiribati government itself, which is, of course, a low-lying nation famous for being part of the island group bloc that forced a 1.5 degrees C target into the Paris discussions as islands that are critically vulnerable to sea level rise. Well, they're also an island nation that has some of the world's most healthy coral reefs, including the one that I study on. And so when you talk to those stakeholders about the coming decline of the reef and how El Niños are impacting them and how they might change in the future, they're all ears, and they're quite desperate for that kind of information. They want to lift it up on the national stage and the international stage and make sure that people are aware that it's not just sea level rise. It's the other impacts of loss of livelihood and loss of their economic value and loss of their shoreline management that's going to come from the loss of reefs. So those are some very privileged and special conversations I've been able to have. And then, of course, the state of Hawaii is also a forum that I've been privileged to interact with. And I've had a chat with the governor of Hawaii about our work, and with all of the folks who are involved in climate action planning for the state of Hawaii. And they are also all ears. They want to hear all that I have to say about what happened on the reefs at the equator. Of course, they had massive bleaching during that same event in Kaneohe Bay. in 2016. And so this is coming home for them. And they are very aggressively pursuing a climate action plan that includes adaptation measures for coral reefs, as well as resilience and mitigation of greenhouse gases. And so they're an all of the above state, they're all in on climate action. And so that's been obviously really important. The work that I've done in Georgia has had a huge amount of resonance across the aisle with lawmakers here in Georgia, especially the project on smart sea level sensors down on the coast. I have had meetings with Representative Buddy Carter, the congressional representative from the entire coast of Georgia, and he is very engaged in our project. He wants to understand what we're doing. He very strongly supports bolstering resilience for coastal communities in Georgia against sea level rise and flooding. So there are many kind of the same pages that we can get on when we're talking about keeping communities safe today and planning for tomorrow. Those are actually really important conversations to have across the aisle. So again, I feel privileged to be in that room and to have discussions with those kinds of stakeholders. Obviously, the easiest and conversations to have are with the members, including our 2 new senators and some of our representatives here in Georgia on the Democrat side. I'm just eager to hear how they can help, how they can support, how they can move this work forward on the ground. And obviously deeply invested in Georgia Tech being a part of this going forward as well. So that was, sorry, a long answer, but that was a good question.
That's okay. That's a really good segue to the next question, which is what challenges, if any, have you faced advocating for climate change and science in a purple state such as Georgia?
Yeah, well, Georgia's a special place at a special time right now. And I think we can all appreciate that. It's changing very quickly, but it's also kind of battleground. It's become battleground #1 in terms of some of the efforts around voting rights and the debacle that still continues to stay on the front page of the New York Times about our last election process as well. And so I think the positioning that we have taken as climate forward scientists and in some ways activists here in Georgia is one that recognizes the importance of a diversity of voices in the space, of supporting each other through this process of being at the front lines, of being visible on climate. The fact that makes you a target. We have to stick together in ways here in Georgia that you wouldn't maybe have to do in other places as much. So, all of these Twitter wars and climate Twitter getting itself into a frenzy and, shooting with friendly fire, and that would be unheard of in this state. And in fact, the people who work shoulder to shoulder in Georgia on climate, they do bring a diversity of voices. They bring a diversity of perspectives and a diversity of priorities, which is exactly what you need to advance the climate conversation. But we absolutely have each other's backs, and we understand the need to engage across the political divide. And we have to make our case with data and facts, but also, as I said before, grounded in culture, grounded in the politics and the geography and the economy here in our state. And so that's what really, you cannot move in Georgia unless you are kind of wrapped in that and just imbued with that. In a way, it's like a common sense approach in terms of being able to discuss these things in such a polarized environment. But you learn very quickly what missteps look like, and you learn very quickly what success looks like. And success definitely looks like being able to speak to Congressman Buddy Carter down on the coast one day and come up and engage with the mayor's office in Atlanta the next day and still bring the same caliber of research, still bring the same respect, and still be asking the questions, oh, what do you care about? Why does this work matter to you? How can we align it along your priorities? And then listen. And so those are all the skills I've kind of tried to build on the fly in the trenches here in Georgia. And I have to say that, it's become clear that this is the front lines in many ways of the discussion about climate across the United States. So we say if it can happen in Georgia, it can happen anywhere.
Yeah, I mean, it must be like a pretty exciting time to be in Georgia, but I imagine there's probably also a lot of different things that are kind of demanding your focus and your time with all things that are happening there. Okay, your bio mentions that you're a big proponent of DEI efforts. What are your best recommendations for how we in CCL can walk this important walk as well? And maybe you can tell us a little bit about what DEI is.
Yeah, so something that, as a woman in science, I've long understood is that if we could kind of really move to include the voices and the priorities and the talents of people who are marginalized from the powerful communities that control the course of science in my case, or the academic career structures as well. But also with the climate space, it's no different. We really do have a diversity problem, certainly in climate science, but I would say across the broader landscape in climate as well. It has been the purview of a few privileged, I would say, senior white men who played outsized role in controlling the narrative and the evolution of kind of public opinion in this space. And of course, it has been to our downfall. And certainly as somebody who has grown up as a physical scientist, one of very few women, at my level, I've kind of I'm also birthed 4 children. So I have a kind of a unique perspective, from that outsider's view of, why the benefits of embracing diversity, equity, inclusion in science and academia. And now in the climate sphere is just an extension of that previous work that I've been doing for over 10 years now. So I do hold an institutional role as a professor for diversity, equity, inclusion at Georgia Tech, which challenges me to work with the upper administration as well as the rank and file faculty and students and staff across the institution, especially in College of Sciences, where my appointment is, to try to make sure that we are advancing institutional policies to promote diversity, equity, inclusion in all of its colors and all of its flavors. And so obviously now we're really focused on racial equity and justice. We're always focused on the structural and systemic issues that are posed by women and childbearing and childcare. And now with the pandemic, we have a new focus around the pandemic related inequities that are emerging in science and academia. So what does it mean for the climate movement to think about the role for justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion? It means that we have lost so much of our potential audience, so much of our potential momentum, because we have been loath to turn this attention to ourselves and challenge ourselves to achieve some of our highest ambitions in this space. And we share these ambitions across everybody. To a one in the climate movement will share this high level of ambition to be diverse, because it's the right thing to do, and it's important and it's effective. And we want to be inclusive because we need to build a movement of folks who deeply care about this and are willing to give for it. So I think it's really about working to incorporate, lift up, learn from, and lead with the voices of the folks who are already leading in this space or could use the additional platform that CCL has to further their cause, and to join forces with and learn from and lift up, et cetera, and to incorporate their agenda as part of your own. So I've been on calls with some of our partners down in Savannah. We're working with environmental justice organizations down in Savannah. I was just on an equity weekend workshop with them this weekend, where I was hearing things like sustainability is only a means to liberation and freedom. And if you don't agree with that statement, maybe you should not be partnering with us, right? And so kind of makes you stop and think, what are we working towards? Are we working towards freedom and justice for everybody, is that the first thing that we would say our organization is about. And maybe that's not the case, right? And how can we grow an agenda and grow a membership and grow a community where that is the core piece of what we're about? We're about equity, and we're about justice, and we're about power redistribution here. And that's some big stuff. And I don't pretend to have all the answers, but it's a journey that I've really been purposely walking in the last several years, especially through our work with urban heat ATL and smart sea level sensors, recognizing that historically marginalized, low-income, often communities of color are the first to experience the climate impacts. And they are, of course, experiencing them in the worst ways with the most significant losses. And so if you're working for climate solutions and you're not starting with the folks that are most impacted, are you really aiming in the right direction? So that's kind of been a process of thinking about turning our North Star as a program in that direction. And I'm happy to have partners who are patient enough with us to help us along the way.
Thanks. Yeah, those are issues that we at CCL definitely try to keep in mind and address too. Sea level sensor question. How do they work, and what have the measurements been so far? Or maybe how have you utilized the data from the sea level sensors?
Oh my God, that's a lot, but let me answer with how they work first. So they are ultrasonic sensors. And so it's an off-the-shelf part, and it sends a sound beam down to the surface. And you maybe have heard about this with, echo and things. It's the same technology, and it bounces off the surface, and the travel time is a distance that it records in the sensor data. And then that data is uploaded into a communications hub. There actually is 14 of these gateway hubs that we have installed in Chatham County in Savannah. And these collate the data from sensors within a 1 to 4 mile radius, and they're collecting them all to these gateways. And then those are beaming them over, hardwire Ethernet to our servers. And there we build the database of water levels across all of these dozens of sensors. And so then what do we do with the data? We do what our stakeholders request us to do. So their number one request was, it would be really important to know when, for example, water is close to touching the bottom of a bridge, right? They have bridges that were built decades ago, and when they have a flooding event, whether it's a king tide event or a named storm, or just a wind event out of the blue that's long enough to push water around, the water level starts rising, and they have over 200 bridges in Chatham County alone. And if water touches one of them, they have to shut it down to trigger a structural inspection by engineers. And they want to know if water touches it. So their request of us was, please take your water sensor data and create a tool that helps us understand when water is getting within a foot of the bottom of the bridge. And that's kind of enough for us, because there's waves and things like that can happen that we won't see. But we call it the bridge tool, and it's been developed for the Chatham Emergency Management Agency, and has really helped them expedite their very limited resources during ever increasing king tide events. And of course, in a post-inspection from a major named storm, it does help them understand how to focus structural teams to visit those bridges that were very likely touched. So that was our first request from us. And now we're on to different requests with the city and the county in terms of thinking about flood scenarios and how they impact any number of different metrics that they want to know about. They want to know about the economic losses during potential floods. They want to know about the how it impacts critical infrastructure like the grid and the hospital networks. They want to understand how various sea level rise scenarios play into their larger, longer term development plans for stadiums and green spaces and parks, et cetera. And so now we're getting to a lot higher levels of sophistication with combining the water level sensor data with longer term projections from climate models, and then bringing those into a conversation about planning for not just the next year or two, but potentially decades into the future. So those are planning tools and platforms that we're putting together at the request of the city and county. So this is a longer term research project, clearly.
Very cool. Thanks. Okay. Next question. Are there other developing coastal protection or relief, or are there and are the states in alliance somehow? Are there?
So the landscape for coastal resilience work is just extremely patchy. And that's because it's really been a kind of a state by state kind of initiative, where if you have a state like North Carolina, let's say, they've been really at the forefront of planning for coastal resilience for about a decade now, and they have a lot to show for it. So they have infrastructure, they have flood sensors, they have whole institutes grounded in their state university system that are focused on this issue. And they have a connectivity between the governor's office and the state resilience officers. They actually have resilience officers in North Carolina. And then they connect down to the community level. So they have a great network up and down, and they have this fabulous networks across. I just say that because that's not what we have here in Georgia. So I'll contrast that with Georgia. We have no resilience officers. We have no climate action plan at the state level. We don't have a climate resilience plan at the state level. And so, when we think about going down to Savannah, and you're thinking about, a legacy of leadership, that this was, verboten terminology to use for decades in Savannah. And so when you're going down there and you're, on the heels of those major hurricanes that devastated Savannah in 2015, 2016, Irma and Matthew, you're really talking about a community that is reeling from this devastation and coming into a very late and bad awakening about their future. So this patchwork of state by state efforts has really been, crippled us in terms of a research community, enabling us to learn from each other quickly and be kind of rapid adopters of each other's best practices. That's what should have happened. Right now, we're facing a new landscape where there's a ton of money coming in from the infrastructure bill, coming in from hopefully Build Back Better, focused on coastal resilience specifically, but more climate adaptation broadly speaking as well. And so we're seeing NOAA and NASA go big and go deep on these programs that are going to connect communities across this country with researchers who are holding the evidence in some of these amazing tools and try to get it into action planning, try to get it on the ground to work for communities right now. So we're late to that effort at the federal level. I think we can all understand why we are late to that at the federal level. But we are ready as researchers to get down on our coast and get to work, even in a state like Georgia, where we've been able to get, again, the highest density water level sensor network in the world here in Savannah, in a state that doesn't even have a climate action plan or climate resilience plan.
Interesting. Yeah, there was actually just a bipartisan climate resilience bill introduced in, I think, both the Senate and the House that we're looking into. It looks really interesting to at least get the federal government to kind of consider climate resiliency, which is kind of cool.
There's quite a bit of resilience work in infrastructure bill as well, mostly like grid and transportation infrastructure.
Yeah, that's true. Good point. Okay, emotional question. Can't imagine the loss you've witnessed with the coral bleaching events. How do you manage such heavy emotions with this loss and its serious implications?
Yeah, it was not a fun time at the end of 2016. So I've always been very open about that. I did basically shut down for a whole 3 weeks, and anybody who knows me knows that really takes a lot. I really didn't get out of bed. I was in a pretty deep depression in late 2016, and maybe many of you were as well. I don't know, but it felt very lonely and very overwhelming. And so, I think the only way I've been able to kind of create a narrative that keeps me getting up every morning is one where I have choices to make every day, and I can get up and just move the needle a little bit more in the direction that I know it needs to go. And I feel as I've gone through this last several years, grown a community that I didn't really know existed prior to 2016, or maybe I was dimly aware, but I didn't consider myself a part of it for sure. And now I do feel part of it. And I feel that it's growing every day. And I feel everybody's finding their place and finding a way to contribute. And we're all doing different things that are adding up in amazing ways. So I kind of get this fuel going. That's a kind of a lofty answer. I will give you some more basic answers, which is I take it all out on my bike. So, somebody asked me today in an interview, like, do you have any like Zen moments? I think she was thinking of something very different. And I'm like, yeah, I just get on my bike with some Beyonce blaring and I just try to beat my PR to work on my bike. And she's like, okay. But actually getting on my bike in January of 2017, I think is what really saved me from a lot worse despair and pits of depression. And I started just biking to work once a week. And it was extremely important for me just from a mental health perspective. I had no idea I didn't know it would be like that until it was. And then I become just one of these crazy biker people. So I have multiple bikes. I just bought an e-bike. It has changed my life. Go out and get one. It will change your life. I hope you get the picture. So biking to me has been a very, very important grounding. And it doesn't hurt that I'm avoiding CO2 in the process of biking around, but it also has helped me understand how to be part of a biking community in Atlanta, which is very strong and very solid and have each other's backs and are down at City Hall advocating for pedestrian bike infrastructure every week. And so, this is part of the momentum I need to feel, and it's in my backyard and it's on my way to work and it's meditative and it's a way to be outside and it checks all the boxes for me. And I don't know where biking was and when I was trapped there 14 years in my car in Atlanta.
I'm actually going to cheating because I have a question along those lines from one of our Sacramento chapter volunteers, Kathy, because she was wondering about basically both the climate and environmental impact of electric cars and electric vehicles versus, combustion vehicles, because, electric motors and batteries require earth elements that have to be mined. And sometimes there's problems with the mining and both human rights and environmental impacts. So I wonder if you could weigh in on kind of the comparison of those.
Well, from a climate perspective, obviously, I think we can all understand how important it is for us to transition away from combustion engines and into electric vehicles. Do we have everything sorted out in terms of ethical, transparent supply chains? Absolutely not. Do we have everything sorted out with respect to the technology for recycling those precious batteries? Absolutely not. Is there an economy to support that? Probably not right now. But I'm really heartened because here in Georgia, we just had a major EV company take up shop right outside Atlanta. Rivian makes electric trucks, pickup trucks and things like that. And then we just had in the last 3 weeks an announcement that there'll be a major battery manufacturer landing here in Georgia with a very strong focus on developing battery recycling technologies. And so even in Georgia, we're starting to see this agglomeration of industries that really need each other. And it's going to be a major R&D effort for them to come together and think about what they can do to, for example, advance battery technologies and advance recycling of batteries. And the Georgia Tech engineers that I know work in the space of batteries, and we have a huge group on battery technology R&D, are really excited about the opportunities to work with them. And so I think that's what we're going to see. We're going to see more investments in that space, and we're going to see advanced technologies in that space. And we'll be looking back at this in 20 years going, I don't know why we were worried about this. We now are able to recycle these batteries and really get that last little nudge that we will need to unlock a larger scale of use here. That's what I'm hoping comes to be. And I'm here in Georgia looking around, thinking that that's going to happen sooner than I thought.
Great. We're always happy to hear about battery recycling. So we're almost out of time. Is there any particular question you see up there that you would like to answer?
Oh my goodness.
There's still a lot left.
Yeah, I love the one about, have you noticed a better response to your research when you include your personal story? Yes, absolutely, yes. I think people really want to know from a climate scientist how they add it up and, how they, do the work and how they find purpose and meaning in the work. and whether they are hopeful or not. And when they weren't hopeful, they really want to hear about that too. So I think bringing, your full self, and I'm not for everybody. I'm certainly a lot to handle with all of my no flying and my biking craziness. And, I'm an evangelist for some out there stuff. So I'm not for everybody, but I think they can understand where my passion comes from and what drives me and why I do what I do and what I'm fighting for. All of these things help people connect the dots for themselves. And so, as I'm very fond of saying, it's not that I do so many public talks because I'm thinking that, every talk I give, is creating a waterfall of new people into the climate movement. I think Catherine Hayhoe says it herself too. She says, if there's just one person in that audience who is moved to do something differently with how they're approaching climate, how they're talking about climate, what they're caring about, how they can connect the dots to their own values, whether they're going to go out and buy an e-bike, that is such a win for me. And so, the sense that they matter is important to them too. And we're all humans, we're all in this together. And so, it's really important. It's been very rewarding for me and keeps me going to be able to share that, because I can tell you I've given many dry scientific talks in my entire life. And these that I'm giving tonight are much more exciting and rewarding for me.
Great. Well, we really appreciate you bringing us your full self on school night for an hour and giving us some of your time. Brett, I believe, has some concluding remarks for us.
If you want me to, yeah, I can easily. Dane is actually going to be joining us again in 2 nights for a CCU, a Citizens Climate University, specifically looking at inflation. And if you've had concerns or questions that you've seen in the media coverage about inflation and its connection to climate policy, Dan is going to help set us straight with all of the research done to really highlight the minimal impacts on that. So please tune back in, same channel on Zoom here in 2 nights. But I just want to echo what has already been uplifted by Dana, and just thanking you so much, Dr. Cobb, for joining us tonight. For those that are interested, here is how you can follow her research, her whole team's approach at Georgia Tech, as well as her amazing personal Twitter feed. We've got that here in the chat. I'll put a link to that as well. But please just know how grateful we are for your time, for your involvement, for your research, and the chance to really learn from all that you've done tonight, obviously to benefit all of the CCLers that are attending in live, as well as those that are tuning in later. We can't thank you enough for the work that you're doing.
Well, likewise, I'm really so amazed at Citizens Climate Lobby as well, and have been a cheerleader of theirs for several years now, and frequently name drop them in answers when people ask me what they can possibly do, what national orgs are out there, CCL. So thank you for all that your community does to advance climate change solutions, and it's super impactful work. So right back at you there. And I want to make a special note to those people who didn't get their questions answered tonight. Please feel free to DM me on Twitter. My DMs are open, or drop me an email. And I'm happy to do what I can to answer those. There are a lot of good questions I didn't get to. So thanks so much for coming.
You are incredibly generous, and we are so grateful for all of those offers, Dr. Cobb. So I'm going to unmute all lines just so that you can get on the Love Fest here for all of our folks attending. Stay safe out there, everyone. Keep up the great work, and we'll see you on the other side. Thank you again, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kim.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Very useful. Thank you.
Thanks. Good night.